Dave, it's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to be here.
Yeah,
Nice to see you again.
you too. Today's conversation is occasioned by some exciting news, which is that you have the third edition of the World Atlas of Whisky coming out soon. Many of us have profited greatly from reading it, and I think it's shaped not only our understanding of whiskey technically, but philosophically. And so I think some discussion of that is in order, but I think the simplest and broadest question that I and others want to know the answer to is what's new in this book?
Oh God, everything.
If not everything.
Yeah, yeah. The last edition came out 10 years ago, uh, and we've been talking about doing an update for a few years, and it was scheduled for pre-COVID, but obviously that then knocked everything back, and other projects kind of began to take priority. And then when I kind of suspected this was going to be the case, but when I then looked at the book and then looked at what had happened in whiskey over the past 10 years, it became immediately apparent that this could not be an update, it had to be a complete rewrite. So
Yeah.
essentially, this is a new book.
I'm curious a bit about the process. So I assume this required some travel, some places, some people.
Yeah, yeah,
What's it?
a fair bit of travel, and I mean, I travel quite a lot anyway. So knowing that this was going to happen at some point, I was out there kind of taking notes. I was over in the States a couple of times promoting Sense of Place, which came out whenever it came out last year before. Uh, so I was going around distilleries, then getting information, then meeting up with distillers, perhaps when they were coming over here for whiskey shows and trips to Australia, New Zealand, etc. So yeah, a fair bit of travel was involved, which is always enjoyable. Uh,
Yeah.
and then if travel wasn't possible, then it's conversations on platforms such as this, with distillers, telephone calls, etc., etc. So, and then a huge number of samples coming into the house. My wife is cursing me because essentially my office is just a repository for cases and cases of whiskey. Which is a nice problem to have,
First
but
problems,
yeah,
yes.
there was a lot of booze coming in as well, so it was quite a protracted process.
Among the new things coming in, I think it would be interesting to think about how flavor camps, as they're discussed in your previous editions, have any of those have these samples sort of pushed at the borders of those, or caused any new creation of flavor camps?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question, Adam. Yes, the number of flavor camps has been widened, and yeah, basically, I can't remember what they all are now. Uh, Simply because the styles of whiskey which are coming out are widening so greatly. It did involve kind of re-examining the idea of flavor camps. The flavor camps are still there, but I think, I mean, I would say one good example, and I think a lot of it was driven, I think, by American whiskey, and also by rye, in particular, and rye not just from the US, but rye around the world, because there's amazing rye getting made in Europe at the moment. And stylistically, they're actually quite different. So the European ryes are very different to American ryes. So there had to be a kind of division there, uh,
Mhm.
for that much more kind of intense herbal rye bread style, rather than the straight ryes from the US. And also, I would say, one of the trends I've been noticing in some American whiskies, not all American whiskies, is the enthusiastic use of oak. And so I think another flavor camp came in, sort of really, essentially covering off oak driven characteristics in whiskey. Where the cask was undoubtedly the dominant player, not sole player, but the dominant player. So yeah, so it was a widening of the flavor camp, but I think that wasn't that inevitable, really? You know,
Yeah.
given that essentially every country where distilling is legal is now making whiskey, and is making whiskey in its own way, then it could no longer be corralled into the flavor camps which existed 10 years ago. You know, it had to be widened. So that in itself was exciting.
Yeah, and I think many of us reading A Sense of Place or The Way of Whiskey got a much deeper understanding of the relationship between where whiskey comes from and what its kind of through line is, and what the influence of local culture has been. It would be interesting, and I'm sure is covered in the book, where producing regions that are less familiar to us so far, those who are interested in whiskeys from around the world, do you find that they're kind of developing a national or a regional or a particular style in most cases, or is it more experimentation where maybe there's a lot of variety within a given place at this point that sort of coheres over time?
I think it's a bit of both. To be perfectly honest, I described the book. I mean, the interesting thing about the book, this might be a slightly oblique answer or an oblique start to the answer. Uh, there are so many distilleries in the world now. It was impossible to include everybody in the book. It always was impossible to include everybody in the book. It certainly is impossible now, other than to make it simply a catalogue. So hard decisions had to be made, and I relied on a lot of friends around the world. You know, we chatted about the most interesting and most forward thinking. It's obviously the longest established and the biggest, etc., etc. But of the new grouping of distillery, the new wave of distillery, who are the ones who are doing the most fascinating things and moving things forward. So for me, that this is an atlas insofar as it's saying what is happening in the world. So you can look at the world and say, all right, that distillery is there and this is happening here, etc., etc. So you can use it as a map in that sense. But I think it's also a map of mindsets. And that for me was the most interesting thing that was happening, uh, which is coming back to your point, actually talking to distillers in, well, whether that was Norway or Australia or New Zealand or US or wherever, finding out what their thinking was. Why were they making these whiskies? What was their thought process in the decision points that they were making to create the flavors that they wanted? Uh, and then the interesting parallels that began to appear while talking to distillers all around the world to see commonalities in ways of thinking and perhaps in approaches, but actually different results in terms of flavor. And I think what for me is probably the most exciting thing coming out of the book is it's kind of reinforcing of something that I've believed for a whole number of years in talking to non-classic country distillers, is that the first question that you would ask is, right, what are you making? And their response would be, we're not making Scotch. Now we're going, great, that's fine, that's good, that's the right thing to make. But what are you making? And they would say, well, we're making something that is from here, because we're using our own grains. We're hostage to the climate, so the maturation cycle is going to be different. The food culture, and I think this is a particularly interesting one for Nordic whiskies as well. The new Nordic food movement, which essentially started off by saying, why are we following slavishly? Why are we following the French way of cooking when we've got all these incredible ingredients? Why aren't we using what grows around us and actually finding our own ways and our own flavor template in terms of flavor? That has had a direct effect on the thinking of Scandinavian Nordic distillers. And you see the same thing beginning to happen and beginning to cycle through, I would say, all the countries making whiskey in the world. And in terms of the regional styles, I'm not really a great believer in regional styles. As as you well know, they don't exist in Scotland. So good God, they're not going to exist in the US, infinitely bigger. But I do think it's fascinating to see and then compare the approaches and flavors of whiskies coming from Texas, whether that's bourbon or single malt, and what is happening in Pacific Northwest, for example, which is driven very much by mindset, but also by climate. So is that a regional style? To some extent it is, because it is appreciating or just existing within the conditions which do exist in those particular places. So I think there's a whole number of really fascinating areas that are well worth exploring, and distillers are beginning to explore as well. One of the, I think one of the most exciting things about talking to Australian distillers is that in those early days, it very much was taking the Scotch template and moving it, and the Tassie style began to develop in a very specific way. But in many ways, the look was always towards Scotland, not making Scotch, but the impetus and the motivation perhaps was driven by Scotch single malt. But you talk to the new generation of distillers coming in, the new distilleries that they're opening up there, and their reference point is now the previous generation of Australian distillers. So people are, instead of looking to Scotland, they're looking to Peter Bignell at Belgrove. They're looking to Sullivan's Cove. They're looking to the Australian solutions to the issue of how you make the whiskey. And I think this second generation of new distillers is going to be really fascinating, because they're not looking over to Scotland anymore. They're looking locally. They're looking to see what is happening in their own country, and how their forebears went about trying to create something which was authentically Australian or Norwegian or Japanese or whatever. And I think that is hugely exciting. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's great. There's some parallels there, I think, with Japan. You see in the early days, sort of the Scottish template, and
Absolutely.
then figuring out how do we settle this? How do we take the best from the Scottish template and then settle it into the context of Japanese tastes and preference
exactly.
in food?
And I would say, just picking up on that, it is really fascinating to talk to Scotch distillers, Scottish distillers from the new wave of distilleries that are opening in Scotland, and seeing how they are referring to what's happening in Japan, and using
Yeah.
Japan as a template for what's happening in Scotland, going, actually, that Japanese technique could work over here. And we'll do it in the Scottish way. So it's almost kind of gone, it's almost like gone full circle. You look at what Suntory are doing, what Suntory did at Glengarry, in Aberdeenshire. Oh, conceivably the oldest distillery, single malt distillery in Scotland. And what's happened is they've put back in direct fire, and they've opened up floor maltings, etc., etc. So they're kind of Suntory were using the understanding of what's happened at Yamazaki and Hakushu, and actually are now applying it to the Scottish estate. And that's so there is this fluidity, I think, which is happening within whiskey, where ideas are being exchanged, and techniques are being shared, etc., etc. But the basic principle still stands, which is we'll take this element from Japan, or we'll take this element from Norway, or take this element from the US, but we will make it our own, and we'll apply it with our own mindset about how to make our own country's whiskies better. So yeah.
Yeah, and it seems a bit of a mistake to think of Scotch as one thing too, because you almost have two parallel industries going on. You have tradition, or perhaps it may be only a different business model, in that you have to have consistency for those companies that are that have a foothold around the world, and produce a massive amount of whiskey for blends and things like that, versus sort of those who can't participate in that reciprocity of sharing casks and things like that, who are sort of on their own to develop a name for themselves, and who are doing that in some ways by innovation, and in some cases innovation looks more like going back to traditional methods.
Yeah.
And I assume probably in the book, has that caused you to shake up some of the way the Scotch chapter looks? Are there perhaps new divisions in the geographic groupings and things. I know
Yes,
you're on the forefront of talking about the Western and the
yeah.
Hebridean style and things like that. Has that shifted around a bit?
Yes, yeah, it has. Yeah, I've divided Scotland up in the way that I wanted. I wanted to basically. So essentially, we've got north, rather than Northern Highlands, Eastern, Western, etc. So we've got north. We've also got west now as well. So kind of west is, everything from Campbell, everything up that west coast. Isla is part of it, but that western seaboard, Hebridean. Uh, Region it has now got its own, because I think there's just more commonality, and I think that there's interesting shared thinking going on there. And then I've given Fife its own little section as well, because I just think there's more intriguing things in Fife. And also borders. So rather than lowlands, there's actually lowlands have kind of been split because there's kind of a central lowland element, because there's so many new distilleries opening there. But also that there's a huge number of distilleries which have opened in the borders. So they've kind of maybe passed people by, because he's very excited about the West and everything. So the borders I have been grouped together as well. And they're grouped together, are they grouped together stylistically? Not really. I mean, there's still a kind of geographical way of looking at these things. But it is interesting to see the commonalities between some of these guys in terms of thinking. And obviously, certainly on the West Coast, there's incredible synergies between what's happening at Ardnamurchan with what's happened at Campbellton or Ben Nevis or whatever. And the Hebridean distillers, are all talking to each other, so there appears to be some element of a style beginning to develop there as well. So yeah, everything was up for grabs, basically. I mean, there's, in terms of like the layout of the book, there's fewer pages for. I wasn't allowed any more pages. this was the other challenge. I was not allowed any more pages. So some things came out. Some of the lovely DPS photography came out. The Scottish section is shorter, but there's more distilleries in it. So yeah,
That's quite a
there
task.
was yeah the layout and the discussions around the layout went long into the night, really. But yeah, everybody else is making more whiskey, so everybody else had to more space.
Yeah.
So yeah, Scotland was the one that was squished a bit. Yeah. But
Is
more
there
information.
a category that is particularly holding your attention right now?
Uh, in terms of countries, I think I've kept talking about them just in this conversation, and I'm really excited about what's happening in the Nordics. I'm not long back from France. There's some great things happening in France. Really, there's over 100 distilleries in France now making whiskey. So 10 years ago there was 3, 5 maybe. This has been why I've gone increasingly grey. It's just gone crazy. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. New Zealand, what's happening in New Zealand, I think is fascinating for a whole number of reasons. American single malt, quite definitely, it is just going to be an incredible journey that all these distillers in America are going to go through. So yeah, those are the ones that are at the moment I think are really exciting me. The new wave of Japanese distillers, there's some very, very good things getting made there. I mean, I could go on. In fact, there's now 30 odd distilleries in China. Another one started up this week. They're not in the book. They only started this week. You know.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a very hard task to pin down a subject matter that's swerving around so much, I think.
It's impossible. It's as simple as that. It is impossible.
When did you start this?
There was quite a funny one actually, because I just finished the Mexico South American chapter. I thought, yeah, I think I've got everybody that needs to be in there. And I was going through Instagram in the morning, and bing, this message popped up. Uruguay's first whiskey distillery opens. Oh, Jesus. So it's
Huh.
straight in touch with the publisher going, that map about South America? Could you put a dot in Uruguay, please? Yeah, but it's crazy. I didn't mention Ireland. Amazing things coming out of
Yeah.
Ireland. The revival of pot still, single pot still. The next 5 years, the new distilleries, and they're very new. They might be 5-7 years old. The whiskies are now just beginning to appear in the market. There's been a lot of brands coming out using sourced whiskies. The same thing that happened in the States. But what is about to come out of Ireland is hugely, hugely exciting. So
And I imagine that's one that pushed at the boundaries of the flavor camps.
yeah, another one. Yeah, there's essentially a pot still designation. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying it keeps you young, but it keeps you interested.
Yeah.
That's the thing about whiskey; it never stays still. We're often lulled into this belief that it has been fixed. Because whiskey's been around for so long, it's been fixed. And it's tweaked every so often, perhaps. But it's essentially what we love about it is the fact that it's consistent and it's boom and it's always there, and it's it's reassuring in that way because it appears to be unchanging, and that's so untrue. That the way in which whiskey has shifted over centuries, and I would say essentially also over the past 2 decades, is remarkable. Picking up on something you said earlier, just looking at the way in which distillers in Scotland are now going back to some of the principles of whiskey making in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Re-examining direct fire, looking at old, what would have been contemporary barley varieties in those days are now heritage varieties. Looking at heritage, growing barley for flavour rather than for yield. This pushback against efficiency and yield, which is one of the big kind of battlegrounds, and I would say in Scotch at the moment. So there's this, this questioning that is going on in whiskey is fascinating, and I'm particularly excited about it in Scotch. Obviously being Scottish, that Scotch, perhaps because of its dominant position for so long, for essentially a century, it was the only global whiskey style, in any volume. The fact that it now is being challenged, I think, has spurred distillers from small companies and from larger companies into thinking about what is Scotch whisky, and the answers are really exciting. So this global movement of trying to understand, and trying to create this thing called 21st century whisky. It's not Scotch sitting over here going, okay, we're sorted, guys, and everybody else is kind of, racing around, over there somewhere. That's not the case. That's not the case. Scotch is having to move forward and is moving forward. And I think the same applies to bourbon as well. Where is bourbon? Bourbon is made, could always be made, everywhere in the US. But look at the way in which bourbon is being made in different states, and the flavors that
Yeah.
are beginning to develop because of climate, because of thinking, etc., etc. And then look at the bourbon styles that are coming out of Australia, for example, or France.
Yeah.
So that's what's exciting for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think one of the things that's great about this book, and that I think we use at the Council of Whiskey Masters, we use this book as the study text for the level 2 exam, which takes people sort of out of their chosen track, which they start with Scotch or with bourbon, and then they go level 2 into kind of the whole world, and they're sort of thrown in the deep end of thinking about all these different whiskeys and different styles. But there's sort of some common threads and things that tend to happen. And particularly in the last 2 decades, I would think just the sharing of information, even the
Mm.
movement of people from one category or style to another. You have people going from Scotch to Irish whiskey, producing interesting things. You have communication. You have these feedback loops at a pace and at a intensity that hasn't happened before, and just the knowledge of how we can improve quality through different techniques and things like that, but also how to translate that into your local style. I think
Mm.
kind of the overarching philosophical takeaway from a book like this is fascinating, which is, what does whiskey look like as it moves around the world? But it's not a matter of moving one thing as it exists into another place to have it replicated. It's truly a process of translation where you go from place to place and you have all the local influence, and it's a matter of more interpretation. And
Yeah.
there are some interesting parallels to other categories, to other beverages like wine and things like
Mhm.
that. Once you take an international grape and move it to California or to another place, to Australia or to another place around the world, steadily they develop their own interpretation, but it's still sort of true to the best practices and the learning of tradition.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the parallel with wine is I think fascinating. Yeah, I mean that.
Yeah,
And
I've heard a
also,
few references to wine in interviews with you recently. Are you getting more into wine recently?
well, I came from wine.
Yeah,
I started my career. I mean, all my jobs have been in drink. But my first job was working in a wine shop. I was working in a wine shop for 7 years. When I went freelance, and then I spent 7 years on a trade magazine, and I'd be writing more about wine than it would be about spirits. Although I was writing about spirits. When I went freelance, I was writing about wine and spirit, but then began to specialize. So, wine has always been part of it. I taste. I The way I taste is, you know, I was brought up, learning how to taste wine. So I taste whiskey as I would taste wine. And that was always an interesting one with Michael Jackson,
yeah,
because Michael came from a beer world, and Michael tasted whiskey using a beer reference point, and I
yeah.
would taste whiskey using a wine reference point. Uh, and actually, it leads into something that I think is really fascinating in terms of new distillers, because you have distillers, and they know how to make whiskey, and they've been brought up making whiskey, so that's where they're trained, and they've been trained from day one, essentially, as distillers. Then you have brewers who become distillers, and the brewer's mindset is very different to the distiller's mindset. As I was told many, many times in the Pacific Northwest, distillers don't make good brewers, but brewers make great distillers. But the way in which a brewer is thinking about whiskey was thinking, well, what can I do with the barley? How do I mash? What yeast do I use? How do I kiln the barley? I can build in all these flavors, rather than you know thinking about wood at the end of it. We're actually thinking, boom, let's get this in it early. And then there's also a whole number of winemakers who now become distillers as well. And a brewer's palate is very different to a winemaker's palate. And the whiskies being made by ex winemakers, you speak to them and they are talking about balance, and they're talking about elegance, and they're talking about length. Uh, and they're looking at fermentation, and they're understanding wood. So they're understanding like barrel fermentation. So a lot of the techniques that they're using in terms of their whiskey are coming from the wine world, and their palate is coming from the wine world. So their whiskies are going to taste different to the whiskies being made by the brewers, and they are different from the whiskies being made by distillers. And I find that just amazing. I find that really, really exciting. The way in which all these, what we thought of as being very, very clear, very distinct worlds. As soon as I began writing about spirits more seriously, sorry, man, cable just fell out.
Yep.
As soon as I began, essentially specialising in spirits, that I was told after a year that I no longer wrote about wine by people in the wine trade. No, you've stepped over the line. You've gone to the dark side. Uh, uh, and that barrier which existed between wines and spirits has gone. It is just a world of drink, and there was always some degree of interchange between whiskey and beer, but not great, and not as great as you might think. That's broken down as well. I think mainly thanks to the US. And yeah, I just think the thinking which is now at work within whiskey, coming from people who have started off in different disciplines, uh, that is also helping sort of give this new movement in whiskey greater and greater momentum.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch the overlap and where the thinking comes into contact with other thinking about other beverages. I think one of the big topics in whiskey has been about terroir, and to the extent that that concept is or isn't applicable to whiskey, and maybe you have a spectrum from wine being very terroir driven, and then beer being much more about choices in production, and then whiskey somewhere in between. You have
Yeah,
influences of geography and things like that, but also a very serious amount of influence from culture and people's own understanding of what they're doing when they're creating the beverage. Zooming out of it and taking that perspective, I think, is probably helpful for thinking about any particular category. How much do we
yes, yeah,
value
yeah,
how much do we value what in wine we would call typicity? Like, is this a typical expression of its kind? The regional appellation, the grape, things like that, versus, well, if we expect and we try to sort of compress whiskey into, say, regional classifications, which may be good for book chapters and for tourism and things like that, we're missing a lot of kind of the intellectual landscape of what's going on in whiskey, and so I think it's helpful to have these foils kind of on both sides.
yeah. I wouldn't disagree at all. And yeah, just thinking, I don't, got the terroir argument and everything. But actually, I just read John Bonney's new book about French wine, which just came out. It's an amazing, amazing book. And reading that and thinking about what the new French winemakers, this new generation of French winemakers, who are kind of pushing against the hidebound traditions. They're pushing against the Appalachian system. They're rediscovering old varieties, old vineyards. Areas where the land is perhaps cheaper, but hasn't been known to make great wines, but are now making great wines. Reviving areas which had simply become kind of commodity producers like Beaujolais or Muscadet, increasingly going towards regenerative processes or organic. And then sort of looking at all of that and thinking, well, that's exactly what the distillers are saying as well. you know, Most French whiskey is organic because it is, and distillers don't even say it. So yeah, it's really interesting to see that mindset of winemakers in France, a direct parallel with the mindset of distillers. Now, I don't know if there's a great deal of discussion between the two. I think it's perhaps it's just a generational movement. That people are more concerned, as they should be, about environmental issues. So there's another element that can be kind of brought into the discussion. Why are you making these decisions? And a lot of the decisions which are being made, which have flavor impacts and quality impacts, are driven by sustainability. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this other element that's coming in. Not just what grows here, but what can we grow here that's actually going to benefit the soil and benefit community, etc., etc. That's a hugely important element, which I was aware of, but became increasingly important, and I would say increasingly significant as the writing of the book went on.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, there's sort of a pendulum swing between a time when whiskey was more necessarily embedded in a local economy. You're using the draft to feed cattle, you're using manure from the cattle to grow barley. You have this almost cyclical interaction between distillers and the local economy, and that's something that, for reasons of history, when we're trying to scale up massively and create an international product and go much more industrial, we have a period of time where distilleries are more like factories than like an agricultural outgrowth. And now we sort of swing back because we have different historical conditions that allow us to sort of explore these things, including what's the relationship between tradition and innovation. And there are places where I think you have in some places, and maybe some of this you see in the wine world, where you do have these kind of hidebound traditions where the aspiration of the producer is to create a typical expression of a kind rather than an individually, characterful, particularly unique expression of the product. But a place like Japan, where they seem to have seamlessly interwoven the values of tradition in the sense of maintaining what works, but also being completely at ease with it, testing new things and then seeing what should be incorporated into the corpus of tradition. And I assume this is a process that's sort of carrying out in the regions around the world that you've been to.
Yeah, I would say so. That it's distillers just thinking, how do we move this forward? What levers can we pull?
Mm-hmm.
The market has changed, but it did pick up on something you said earlier. There are kind of parallel tracks operating within Scotch. So just talk about Scotch for a second. Diageo has to make enough whiskey to make 20 million cases of Johnny Walker a year. There is nothing wrong with that. And that whiskey has to be made in distilleries which are able to produce an incredibly consistent product. Great, I get it. So it's not right or wrong. But there is, because of the rise of single malt, there is now an opportunity in terms of new distillers who are not locked into this supplying fillings for blends. They have to, they're forced to create something which is compelling and different and which will cut through. That's going to shift. That's going to shift their thinking. That's going to shift the way in which they approach their whiskey. That if you're making a single malt, if you're making a Scotch single malt, and you're a new distiller, are you going to take Glenfiddich on head to head? No, of course you're not, because you'll get killed. It's impossible. So what are you going to do? And that then means that you then look deeper into where you are and how you make it and what all the flavors are. And I think the other trend, which again is repeated all the way around the world, and I don't think I'm actually answering a question here, but is the way in which distilleries are now being built specifically to help their local community. So this is, in fact, I'm answering the question. This is, in fact, kind of going full circle. That kind of coming back to the distillery as the hubs, and the distiller as having a social responsibility or a moral responsibility for workforce, but also for that wider community. And you see that. It was interesting talking to distillers around the world and how often, without asking the question, how often that theme began to emerge, that we are not just out there to create a brand because we won't be able to take on Diageo. That we might be happy producing smaller amounts for a smaller amount of people, just make it high quality, etc., etc. So many different dynamics. But we are doing this because we feel it's an important thing for us to do, but also we have to give something back to our local community. And in terms of what's happening in Japan and this apparent freedom of thinking that's in Japan, the one name that keeps appearing when you talk to new Japanese distillers isn't so much Suntory anymore, who essentially are the repository of great distilling innovation anywhere, obviously anywhere in the world. But Ichiro Akoto from Chichibu, He's
Yeah.
the reference point because he's proved that it could be done. When Ejiro opened Chichibu, it was a pretty crazy thing to do.
Yeah.
The market had been in like 25-year decline. His own family distillery had closed, and this madman went, "Nah, I'm going to open a new one." This is crazy. It's like the guys at Dingle going, "Oh, Irish whiskey. Yeah, nobody's really buying Irish whiskey. We're going to open a distillery in the far southwest corner of Ireland, or Arran, building a distillery
Yeah.
in Arran. You're mad. The whiskey industry is in decline. You know, you need these people to kickstart an industry. I was going to say something else about Japanese whiskey, but definitely drifting off the topic there.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting looking at specifically the thinking of someone like him because if you're as nerdy about your whiskey studies as I am, you're interested in things like fermentation length and all that sort of thing, and you can go through, um, the malt whiskey yearbook and read about the fermentation length at different Scotch distilleries and so forth, and then you begin asking questions like, well, why are we setting a certain number of hours? Well, it's to fit within the work week. We have a
Mhm.
5 or 7 day production cycle,
Yeah,
which may be necessary if you have an output target. But when you then look at a place like Chichibu, it's, well, how are we deciding on the fermentation length? Well, we're taking the pH. We're,
yeah,
it's ready when it's ready, and
yeah,
same with distillation. We're taking our cut points by taste rather
yeah,
than metrics, and
yeah,
it's fascinating because that, regardless of which part of the world you're in, you can look at that and begin questioning things about how whiskey's made and thinking, wow, they're achieving massive quality improvement by doing things differently, in a way that, rather than looking at proxies, we're looking at the actual thing, which is the fermentation done, to the degree we want it to be done.
yeah. Taste, taste, taste. It's so important. It's I find it quite scary going around distilleries, which I understand why distilleries can be operated, by one person. To be operated by one person lying in bed, technology exists to be able to do that, and you will produce a consistent product. But part of whiskey, but will it be consistent? How consistent will it be? Because every distillation is still going to be slightly different. If all
Mhm.
you're doing is making your cut points or having an automatic cut point governed by time or gravity or whatever, fine. But what flavors? Well, these distillations will still be slightly different. Or if you simply just going to try and push things so that there are there's no bumps in the road. Everything is just like this strange kind of monotone. Is that what whiskey's about? I
Yeah.
don't know. I think whiskey's about having those kind of weird, wild variations, having control and having understanding, but actually being able and being willing to go, actually, that's an interesting thing that's just happened there. I wonder why that has happened, And the only way you do that is actually by nosing, by tasting, by understanding and seeing what happens. And again, I mean, it comes back to that previous comment that you made about Japanese distilleries, about the the Monokozuri approach or the Kaizen approach of continual improvement.
Hmm.
Japanese distillers, not this is big distillers, small distillers. They're not happy with consistency. They want
Hmm.
consistently high quality, but they don't want the same whiskey being made. They want it to be different. They demand that it is different and that it changes and it keeps improving and it deepens in terms of its, in the Japanese term, essence, uh,
Hmm.
to be a more compelling drink. The only way you can do that, you can't do that by automation. You can't do that simply by science. You can only do that by being intimately involved in every part of the process in terms of how flavors are created. And it'd be interesting to see how that approach permeates around the world.
Yeah, I'll be interested too. One other thing I'm thinking about recently, in terms of kind of challenging prior thinking, is how all of this interacts with blends.
Mm.
Because it seems like, the blended category now is kind of within the context or the lane of the producers who can create this consistency in the volume. But there is some indication that, you have an interesting kind of sideline of blenders coming along who are interested in doing things a little bit differently, and that are attracting attention from people who would have told you 5 or 10 years ago, I only drink single malts,
Yeah,
because I like this analytical probing that I do. I want to make my tasting notes. I don't want I want something that has character and some sharp edges that I can kind of appreciate.
mm.
And it seems like, if for no other reason than economic reasons, that some of the new distilleries who are coming up and taking the approach of flavor first, in order to stay alive and to maintain a position in the market, some of that product may end up needing to be bought up by sort of a new breed of blender who
Mhm.
comes
Yep.
along and
Yeah.
chooses interesting flavorful whiskeys, where maybe the ideas were creating fascinating blends, and maybe they aren't as consistent year over year, but that's framed in a positive light, that you get something new. You get a once in a lifetime bottle every every
Yeah,
so often.
yeah, I no, I couldn't agree more. And it was said by a whole number of distillers, including some a couple of pretty large U.S. distillers going, when I was saying, what's the next big trend? There's either American single malt or it was blends.
Yeah.
You look at what Bardstown are doing. Some great blends. Coming out of Bardstown. I think it's an inevitability on a completely different scale. If you look what Woven are doing in Scotland, tiny operation, but what Pete is doing there is extraordinary, and he is bottling small amounts, but each of which is the idea behind it is a whiskey to create a mood, and once it's done, it's done, so it's not replicable. That's fine. It's fine. It doesn't matter. What's next? Which is essentially taking a single malt, single cask approach to the fact, this cask is unique and it's coming from this one distillery, but this one cask will have flavors in it that you will never get in any other cask. Once it's gone, it's gone. Boom, fine. Thank you very much. That was exciting. What's next?
Yeah.
That's the mindset of what Pete is doing, and that's the mindset of a lot of the newer blenders. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also, the brutal fact of the matter is, we're talking about there's something great enthusiasm about all the whiskey that's been made. There is way too much whiskey being made at the moment, and the market is saturated, and we're spoiled for choice, and it will be tough, and distillers will have to find ways around it, and one way of getting around it is going to be blending. So that I would say there's a commercial imperative for a new wave of blends to come out, but I think the new wave of blends has to be cognizant of not trying to be like the old wave of blends. In other words, not trying to take on Johnny Walker, but but do something different. Do something different with this concept of bringing different flavors together to create something which is multi-layered and impossible to produce in one single distillery. Blends ultimately blends are more interesting. I'm sorry, they just are. If when they're
I
done
mean,
properly, they are
complexity and
just more
balance.
interesting.
Yeah, if you value complexity and balance, I think there's a case to be made that just inherently they can achieve those virtues more readily,
Yeah.
than
Or,
anything
or, or
coming
perhaps
out of.
you begin to see distillers again. Both of us keep going back to Japan. Distillers, you know, around the world, making different styles of whiskey in their one distillery, but actually not keeping them separate. The springback model, for example, or the Bruichladdich model, but actually going, well, we're going to produce all these different flavour components, and actually we can create a multiplicity of different blends,
Mm-hmm.
which are single malts, but they're blends, which is the Japanese approach. And the whiskies are just more interesting as a result. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really really interesting area that people are going to begin to explore. And distillers swapping casks, you begin to see that in Europe. Which is great. Swapping casks or doing their own little kind of mini blends, etc. It's
Mm-hmm.
beginning to happen, and I think it demonstrates, I think, the increased collegiality of the industry. The industry was always at a production level, and I'm talking Scotch in particular. I think it also applied in Kentucky. At a production level, everybody gets on, and will share information, etc., etc. At the sales and marketing side, everybody hates each other, and you can understand why. Because you've got to sell your stuff. You don't want him, the other guy to sell their stuff. But I think there is a greater collegiality that's taking place globally within the ski world, and that's great. It's great.
Yeah, and one of the things that's I think interesting on the and a good sign on the blends front is the degree to which blenders, the people who actually do the blending, master blenders, and in different companies are receiving attention, and people are beginning to understand their process and the art form of blending and the difficulty and their accomplishments in this. And Japan has been one avenue into getting malt drinkers to appreciate the the art form of blending. I think it does kind of portend a movement toward a kind of a new shift for malt drinkers. So it'll be interesting to watch how that develops, and then the way that changes relationships within the industry. As you're describing, someone once made the point to me that it wouldn't have made sense in the 70s or 80s rock music scene for bands to regard themselves as hated enemies because they all need the category to be popular.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
I like
the
that.
actual effect is that everyone doing, if your competitors doing well, likely you are too.
Yeah,
And it's
and I couldn't agree more. And I think it's particularly important at this point where the market around the world is softening. Nobody quite knows if it's just a blip and it's going to return to pre-COVID times because everybody just drank loads of stuff in COVID, or whether this is a readjustment and a slowing down of the market. So yeah, I think that's I've forgotten where that particular question was. So, what was the question again?
no, I mean, I think I was just agreeing with you, really. Yeah. Well, I do have a question. Was there anything, and I'm not sure when you began the process of revising for this third edition, but in the process of your research, was there anything that really surprised you, or something that caused a change in opinion, or a big realization that maybe comes out in this third edition that represents kind of a change in your thinking, or are you
I know,
seeing
no,
mostly around the world
uh,
affirmation of what you've seen before?
it sounds really arrogant to say nothing surprised me. Yeah, everything surprised me. I think, you know, yeah. I mean, coming across whiskies I'd never tried before. Coming across, coming across countries who I wasn't really aware of making whiskey in any volume, kind of knowing it was there, but not having access to it.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Going to China last year and having a great session with a friend in Beijing. He'd managed to get samples from a number of different new Chinese distilleries, and kind of going, wow, here's a new world, new flavor world that's beginning to open up. Uh, trying sorghum whiskey in South Africa. Uh, you know, oh, mind blowing stuff. Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, every tasting I did was kind of, yeah, a little kind of, you know, explosions going off in my brain. You know, some of the stuff that Brendan Carter at Cologne or Peter Ryan and Blackwater are doing with Potsdam in Ireland. You know, and you know, essentially saying, well, you know, and using historical references and going, well, why can't we use loads of oats? You know, why can't we use 30% oats as well? Because here's recipes. You know, why can't we do wheat and rye and barley and malt and it all together? Why can't we smoke some of it? Why can't we malt the oats as well? You know, why not? Why not? Why can't we do this? Why can't we do this? Let's just do it. And that was exciting, and it's, yeah, finding the commonalities, which I didn't know existed. That was exciting. Yeah, I mean, it was a slog. I won't, you know, I'll be perfectly honest. You know, I was pulling my hair out at times because there was just so much to try and get down and work out who I could include, and sadly who I couldn't include. But you know, at the end of it, it was a joyous experience.
Yeah, I can
It's
imagine.
a
I
joyous
can
experience.
imagine a tipping point where you realize it's not going to be an update; it's going to be a rewrite.
Well, yeah, I went into, yeah, I mean, I went into the writing knowing it would be a rewrite. You know,
Yeah,
I did, I essentially I warned the publisher probably 3 4 years ago that this would have to be a rewrite
yeah,
and not an update. And you know, you know, I am at kind of pains to say that, you know, because you know, I look back and you know, I thank everybody for continuing to buy the old edition of the Atlas, but you know, looking at it, I was getting increasingly embarrassed about the fact people were still buying it because so much was out
yeah,
of date. Uh,
yeah,
you know, I wish I could change it, you know. And but you know, I was speaking to Ingvar Rond
yeah.
the other day, and you know, the Malt Whisky Yearbook. I mean, he's just finishing the next edition of the Malt Whisky Yearbook. You know, how he does that every year, I don't know. Uh, you know, and you know, he's in a similar situation. You know, the number of pages are the same. The point size just gets smaller every year.
Uh,
uh, yeah, but it's, you know, it just keeps you going. It's so exciting.
yeah. Well, we've been looking forward to the third edition for a long time, and I think there's
Yeah,
nothing to recommend it better than to learn there's so many new surprises, and that
yeah,
it's basically a complete retake of the subject matter. And I know at the council we're already gearing up to update our level 2 exam for when it comes out. So I know it's looking like the release date will be November 26th, and I know
yes, yeah.
it's
It's, yeah, it's around about that point. The reason
yeah,
the reason I can tell you the reason for the delay, I was due to come out the tail end of October uh, to do some promo work on the East Coast because the book would have arrived, but because of the war, because essentially the Suez Canal is shut. Uh, the books are printed in Indonesia, so all the shipping has to go round Cape Horn, not Cape Horn, Cape of Good Hope, uh, and as a result, delivery times have been slightly delayed, but it will be with you by Christmas, folks.
all
So
right, perfect. No, we're looking for it, and I know it's already available for pre-order. So
yes, yeah,
those who
it
are
is.
eagerly looking forward to it can go ahead and place the order for their copy. And I know I think we can look forward to some promotion on the road. Are you planning some visits to different places? And is there a place we
Yeah,
should keep
yeah. I
about
mean,
that?
UK. Yeah, there's an autumn schedule for the UK and maybe Ireland. Uh, that's in place. And as I said, you know, I was due to do an East Coast thing at the tail end of this year. That's been postponed because of the book being delayed. And so I'm going to be doing a tour probably April uh, to the States. So we'll see exactly where I'm going to go. And that's not actually fully decided yet, but it'll be a great chance to come over and see friends and talk about this.
All right, great. Well, I attended one of your book promotion events in the past. I will tell everyone it's well worth it. There's a great talk usually, a nice set of drams to enjoy, meet the local whiskey fans, keep in touch with people. It's a good time. So
Yeah,
we'll keep an eye out for those dates
yeah.
and let people know about it.
Yeah, I will do that. That was a great session. I really enjoyed that one. Well, I enjoyed them all. But yes,
Yeah.
and it's always good. It's going to be an interesting one, this, because there's so many. I've now got so many whiskies to choose from. Sense of Place is actually pretty straightforward. It was
Yeah.
half a dozen scotches. From the book. Boom, we can do this. Now we've got the world to choose from. So yeah, I'm looking forward to what the tastings are going to be, because just try and throw in as many kind of whiskey curveballs as possible.
Wow. Great. Looking forward to that then. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you about these topics. I'm personally looking very much forward to the book. We're looking forward at the council to updating the exam, having a fresh new overview to give people in their level 2 exams, and that I think will prepare them for the level 3 and beyond. And I appreciate you sitting down with me today. Thank you.
No, not at all, Adam. It's great to catch up, and best of luck to everyone doing level 2 and indeed level 3. I hope to see level 3 students next year. It's such a
Yeah,
great
maybe we
incentive
get,
there.
depending on the tour schedule, maybe we can get you to Texas.
Well, you never know. I've been in Texas for ages. I might
Yeah,
melt in Texas. I don't.
that's true.
But it's great. Yeah, but thank you, and thank you for your support. Having a chat.